This is my story, and I want to share it with you.
Karma doesn't miss an address. Life has a way of turning tables. Sometimes, the very hands that feed are the ones people bite the hardest. But what Sandra didn't know was that karma doesn't miss an address. This is the story of Madame Grace, a woman who gave everything for her son's happiness, only to be rewarded with betrayal where she least expected it. Madame Grace had spent most of her life working as a civil servant in Abuja. She wasn't rich, but she lived a comfortable life, built on honesty, resilience, and faith. As a single mother, she had poured every ounce of her energy into raising her only son, David. He was the center of her world, the reason she worked late nights, the reason she denied herself luxuries, the reason she endured hardship with a smile. From primary school to university, Madame Grace made sure David lacked nothing. And when he graduated with good grades, she was the proudest woman in the world. Years later, David got a good job in the city. His mother's sacrifices had finally paid off. It was around that time that he met Sandra, a stunning, confident woman with an air of sophistication. She worked in a corporate firm, dressed sharply, and carried herself like someone who had conquered the world. Sandra wasn't from a struggling background. Her parents were well-to-do, and she had lived most of her life in comfort. David fell in love almost instantly. To him, Sandra was everything he dreamed of: beauty, brains, and class. Madame Grace welcomed Sandra with an open heart. She cooked her favorite meals, invited her to family gatherings, and even gifted her thoughtful presents. She saw her son's happiness reflected in his eyes and wanted to do everything to make Sandra feel at home. At first, Sandra played the part well. She was polite, charming, and warm. But as soon as she and David got married, her true colors began to show. It started with small remarks. She would make snide comments about Madame Grace's old-fashioned ways. She didn't like the idea of living in the family house, even temporarily, while their own home was being renovated. She didn't appreciate Madame Grace's presence in their daily lives. Slowly, the warmth in her voice turned cold, and her smiles became rehearsed. Madame Grace tried to ignore it. "She's adjusting," she would tell herself. "She's young. Give her time." But time, instead of healing, only widened the cracks. Sandra began to subtly push David away from his mother. She would question why he sent her money monthly, why he visited her so often, why he still sought her advice. "David, you're a married man now," she would say, feigning concern. "You can't keep running to your mother for everything. We need to build our life." David, torn between his wife and his mother, often chose silence, a silence that hurt Madame Grace more than harsh words ever could. Then came the blow that Madame Grace never saw coming. One day, David and Sandra invited her to their newly renovated house for a weekend stay. She arrived with a heart full of joy, carrying home-cooked food and small gifts, humming hymns as the taxi pulled into the compound. But from the moment she stepped through the gate, she felt something was off. Sandra's face was tight with irritation, and her welcome was cold. Throughout the weekend, Sandra treated her like an unwanted guest. She made sarcastic comments at the dinner table, rolled her eyes when Madame Grace tried to help in the kitchen, and even complained that she was too involved. Madame Grace swallowed the insults, not wanting to cause a scene. But on Sunday morning, as she prepared to leave, Sandra dropped a bombshell. "Madame Grace," she said, arms crossed, voice dripping with condescension. "We've been thinking. It's not good for us to have visitors all the time. We need our space. Please, before you come next time, inform us. We're trying to maintain our privacy." Madame Grace stood frozen. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the cold, dismissive way they were delivered. David stood beside Sandra, silent as always, his eyes avoiding his mother's. That silence broke something in her. She nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "I understand," she whispered. But inside, her heart cracked. After that day, things went downhill. Sandra made it a point to exclude Madame Grace from family events. Invitations to outings became scarce. Phone calls reduced. Even when Madame Grace fell ill one rainy season, Neither Sandra nor David visited her. Her neighbors were the ones who took her to the clinic and checked on her. She sat by her bedside some nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering how love could turn so cold. But Madame Grace, ever resilient, did not allow bitterness to consume her. She prayed. She cooked for herself. She found solace in church and in her garden. She believed that someday her son would remember her love. Meanwhile, Sandra enjoyed her reign as queen of her home. She redecorated everything, controlled finances, and subtly isolated David from friends and family who questioned her behavior. She thought she had everything under control. But what Sandra didn't know was that karma doesn't miss an address. It began slowly. First, David lost his job during a company downsizing. Sandra was furious. She blamed him for not planning better, for not networking like real men. Their savings dwindled, and their glamorous lifestyle started to crack. Then, the business Sandra tried to start with borrowed money failed spectacularly. Loans piled up, and creditors began to call. Instead of pulling together as a couple, they turned against each other. Arguments became a daily occurrence. David began to drink. Sandra became bitter and resentful. The beautiful home that once radiated wealth now echoed with tension. One fateful evening, David landed in the hospital after collapsing from stress and high blood pressure. The news spread quickly. Who was the first to rush to his side? Madame Grace. Despite everything, she sat by his bedside, prayed for him, and held his hand like she used to when he was a boy. Sandra, overwhelmed and guilt-ridden, didn't know how to handle the situation. David recovered slowly, but the experience shook him. For the first time, he saw clearly. He saw his mother's unconditional love and Sandra's selfishness. He apologized to Madame Grace with tears streaming down his face. "Mama," he said, voice breaking, "I failed you." Madame Grace held him close. "No, my son," she whispered. "Life has a way of turning tables. What matters is that you have seen now." Sandra, however, wasn't ready to humble herself. She tried to maintain her cold exterior, but cracks began to show. Friends she once looked down on distanced themselves. Her business partners stopped returning calls. The walls she built began to close in. In a surprising twist, David suggested that Madame Grace move in with them temporarily after his recovery. He realized how much he needed her presence. Sandra protested at first, but she had lost much of her power. Reluctantly, she agreed. At first, the tension in the house was unbearable. Sandra avoided Madame Grace, rolling her eyes whenever she offered to help. But Madame Grace, wise and patient, didn't retaliate. She cooked meals, cleaned quietly, and treated Sandra with kindness, not because Sandra deserved it, but because that was who she was. Over time, the house began to change. The warmth that had been absent slowly returned. David grew closer to his mother again, regaining his confidence. Sandra watched as Madame Grace won everyone over with humility and grace. And for the first time, Sandra began to feel something unfamiliar, guilt. She remembered the times Madame Grace had bought her gifts, welcomed her like a daughter, prayed for her. She remembered how she repaid that kindness with cruelty. It gnawed at her. One morning, Sandra found herself standing outside Madame Grace's room, tears welling in her eyes. She knocked softly. "Madame Grace," she whispered. When the older woman opened the door, Sandra broke down completely. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I was proud. I was foolish. You didn't deserve any of it." Madame Grace pulled her into a hug. "Sandra," she said gently, "forgiveness is powerful. What matters is that you've learned. Life has a way of turning tables." The same woman Sandra once humiliated became the pillar that held her home together. The same heart she broke became the heart that healed her family. David rebuilt his career slowly, with his mother's quiet support. Sandra, humbled, began to help Madame Grace around the house, learning from her wisdom. Their relationship transformed, not overnight, but steadily, like dawn breaking after a long night. And as for Madame Grace, she lived the rest of her days surrounded by love, not the loud, boastful kind, but the quiet, enduring love that comes from faith, forgiveness, and time. Because truly, karma doesn't miss an address.